Peter Rourke had dirt under his fingernails when the aliens arrived. Not the metaphorical kind that politicians worried about, but actual brown soil from the tomato plants he'd been checking that morning. The tomatoes weren't doing well in New Perth's acidic ground, and he'd spent 3 hours adjusting the pH levels before anyone told him that a warship the size of a small moon had entered orbit. The Draconids were everything humans had imagined aliens might be, except more so. Admiral Sarah Voth walked into the colonial governor's garden party like she owned the planet, and maybe she did. She stood 9 feet tall with scales that shifted from deep red to silver, depending on how the light hit them. Her eyes were ancient, the kind of ancient that made Peter think of mountains and deep oceans. She had wings folded against her back, useless in gravity but beautiful anyway. Peter wasn't supposed to be at the party. He was the caterer's vegetable supplier, nothing more. But Governor Hayes had insisted that the Draconids try real Earth food, grown in real dirt, and that meant Peter had to explain what everything was. Hayes thought it would impress the aliens. Peter thought it was a waste of good produce. The garden party was full of children. That's what Peter noticed first about the Admiral's reaction. She kept staring at them like they were exotic animals. New Perth was a young colony, only 80 years old, and everyone had kids. Large families were practical here. More hands for farming, more minds for problems, more hope for the future. Peter's own 4 children were running around somewhere, probably stealing cookies from the dessert table. Admiral Voth sat down next to him without asking. She moved with careful grace, like someone who had learned long ago that her size intimidated people. Peter was setting out fresh carrots, the purple kind that everyone said looked weird but tasted better. "Why are there so many juveniles?" she asked. Her voice was deep and smooth like distant thunder. Peter laughed. "It's a party. Kids love parties." "No. Why are there so many juveniles on this entire planet?" He looked at her properly then. She wasn't asking to be polite. She genuinely didn't understand. Because people have kids. That's what people do. How many offspring do humans typically produce? Peter shrugged and grabbed a carrot. "Depends on the person. My wife and I planned for 6, but we stopped at 4 after she got sick." The memory still hurt even 3 years later. Claire would have loved meeting an alien. The Admiral went very still. Peter had seen pictures of statues that looked more alive. "4 children," she repeated. "You personally have produced 4 offspring." "Well, Claire did most of the hard work there," Peter said with a small smile. "I just helped. And this is normal for your species?" "Pretty normal, yeah. My brother has 6. My sister has 3. Why?" Admiral Voth looked away across the garden where human children played and laughed and fought over toys. Something in her expression made Peter's chest hurt. She looked like someone watching something precious die. "In my 12,000 years of life," she said quietly, "I have witnessed 4 Draconid births. Only 4. The process requires enormous resources and technology. The success rate is less than 20%. Most Draconids you meet are between 5,000 and 50,000 years old." Peter nearly dropped his carrot. 12,000? You're 12,000 years old. Young by Draconid standards. And you've only seen 4 babies in all that time? "We made a choice long ago. We modified ourselves for extended life. The cost was our fertility. All of it. Forever." She turned back to him, and her eyes were full of something Peter recognized. Grief. The old kind. The kind that had worn smooth with age but never really went away. "We are dying, human gardener. Very, very slowly over thousands of years, but we are dying. There will be no new Draconids. Only old ones getting older. Until one day the last of us forgets to wake up." Peter didn't know what to say to that. What could you say to someone who had watched their entire species commit slow suicide? He did what his mother had always done when words failed. He offered food. "Want a carrot? They're really good." She took it carefully, like it might break. "We discovered humanity 6 months ago. We've been observing your colony here. Your species arrived with 10,000 individuals 80 years ago. Now you number 4 million. We couldn't understand how. Your technology is primitive. Your medicine is crude. Your ships are slow. By all logic, you should have failed below, but we didn't. No. You bred. Constantly. Recklessly. A human generation passes in 20 years, and you fill each generation with more humans. It's..." She paused, searching for words. "Terrifying. And beautiful. and completely impossible for us. Peter bit into his own carrot and chewed slowly. The garden party continued around them. Someone had brought out a guitar and people were singing old Earth songs. His daughter Mira ran past chasing her cousin. She was laughing. She was always laughing. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That sounds really lonely." Admiral Voth made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. "I have commanded fleets for 3,000 years. I have seen galaxies collide and stars die. I have never been lonely until I came here and watched your children play." They sat in silence for a while. Peter poured her some of the wine Hayes had set out. It was the cheap stuff, but the Admiral didn't seem to care. She drank it like medicine. "The High Chancellor wants to meet with your planetary leaders," she said eventually. "There is a proposal. An alliance. What kind of alliance? The kind where we offer you everything we have, all our technology and knowledge and power, and we ask for the one thing we cannot have." The one thing you have in abundance, Peter understood then. He understood with the clarity that came from watching his wife die in a hospital bed, while his children slept in plastic chairs in the hallway. He understood with the weight of being 34 years old and knowing that was considered young, that he had decades ahead of him, that his children would have children and those children would have children and the line would continue, because that's what humans did. They continued. "You want our fertility," he said. "We want a future," Admiral Voth corrected. "We thought we were choosing immortality. We didn't realize we were choosing extinction." Peter thought about his tomato plants that weren't growing quite right. He thought about his 4 children and his dead wife and his brother's 6 kids and the baby his sister was carrying. He thought about New Perth with its 4 million people in just 80 years. And he thought about Earth with its 15 billion. And he thought about the 200 colony worlds that humans had spread to like seeds on the wind. "I can't speak for Earth," he said slowly. "But personally, if you're asking if I'd help." He looked at her, this ancient being with grief in her eyes and the weight of 12,000 years on her shoulders. "Yeah, I'd help. Claire always said I was too generous for my own good. Guess she was right." Admiral Voth stared at him like he'd just offered her the stars themselves. Maybe he had. Maybe that's exactly what he'd done. The leaked recording of Peter's conversation with Admiral Voth spread across Earth's networks like wildfire. Someone at the garden party had recorded the whole thing, probably thinking they'd get rich selling alien footage. Instead, they'd accidentally captured the most important diplomatic moment in human history. Within 48 hours, everyone in human space had heard Peter Rourke say he'd help an alien species reproduce. The reactions were exactly what anyone would expect from humanity. Violent, divided, loud. Peter himself didn't find out he was famous until his eldest daughter called him crying from her university dorm on Earth. "Dad, there are protesters outside my building," she sobbed. "They're saying we're traitors. They're saying you're selling human children." He tried to calm her down while simultaneously dealing with the news crews that had surrounded his farm. Apparently, being a simple vegetable farmer didn't protect you when you accidentally became the face of human-alien relations. His other 3 children had been pulled out of school by officials worried about their safety. Peter's house felt too small and too empty at the same time. Governor Hayes called an emergency meeting. Peter attended because he'd been specifically summoned, which felt strange. He'd never been summoned anywhere before in his life except to parent-teacher conferences, and one incident involving his son, and a very unfortunate accident with a tractor. The meeting room was full of people who looked important and angry. Hayes stood at the front, his face gray with stress. "The High Chancellor of the Draconid Communion has sent a formal proposal to Earth's government. I'm going to read it exactly as written. The proposal was simple in concept and terrifying in implications. The Draconids offered humanity full membership in their galactic community. Faster than light travel, immortality treatments, technology that would make Earth's current science look like stone tools, medical knowledge that could cure every disease, energy systems that could power entire planets forever. In exchange, they wanted human help with reproduction. Specifically, they wanted volunteers to carry hybrid children. Half human, half Draconid. Children who would inherit Draconid immortality, but retain human fertility. They also wanted access to human genetic material for similar hybrid programs with other sterile species in the communion. The room erupted into arguments before Hayes even finished reading. One council member called it slavery. Another called it the opportunity of a lifetime. Someone threw a chair. Peter just sat there wondering how his simple conversation had turned into this chaos. "What about consent?" someone shouted. "Can we guarantee every human involved is choosing this freely?" Hayes held up his hands for quiet. "The proposal explicitly states that all participation must be voluntary. No human can be forced into any part of this program. They're not demanding anything. They're asking. They're asking us to breed for them like cattle," a woman in an expensive suit said coldly. "They're asking us for help," Peter said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He wasn't used to being looked at. "Admiral Voth told me their species is dying. Not quickly, but dying. If humans were in that position, wouldn't we ask for help too?" "This isn't our problem to solve," the woman shot back. "Maybe not. But since when did something have to be our problem before we could choose to help?" The debate raged for hours. Peter left eventually because his youngest needed dinner and homework help, and all the normal parent things that didn't stop just because aliens had upended human civilization. On his way out, Hayes grabbed his arm. "The media wants to interview you. Everyone does. You're the man who offered to save an alien species." "I offered to help one alien I felt sorry for," Peter corrected. "That's different." "Not anymore, it isn't. Earth's government spent 3 weeks arguing before they announced their decision. The hybrid program would proceed, but only with volunteers. Anyone who wanted to participate would receive full medical care, financial compensation, and legal protection. The children born from the program would be considered full human citizens with all rights and protections. 26 humans volunteered for the first wave. Peter was one of them. His children were horrified. His eldest flew back from Earth to argue with him in person. "Dad, you're 34 years old. You have 4 kids already. You don't need to do this." "I know I don't need to," Peter said calmly. He was making dinner while they argued, chopping vegetables for stew. "But Admiral Voth was kind to me after your mother died." "She didn't have to be. She listened when I talked about Claire. She understood grief. Even though her species handles it differently, now she's asking for help and I can give it." "What if something goes wrong? What if you die? Then you and your siblings inherit a really healthy tomato farm and probably some alien technology." His daughter didn't find that funny. None of his children did, but they understood eventually, or at least accepted it. That was the thing about farming families. You learned early that sometimes you had to plant seeds not knowing if they'd grow, trusting that the effort mattered even if the outcome was uncertain. The medical procedures took 2 months. Human doctors worked alongside Draconid biotechnicians to create viable embryos. The science was complex enough that Peter stopped trying to understand it. The basic concept was simple, though. Take Draconid genetic material, combine it with human genetic material, adjust everything so the resulting embryo could develop in a human body, and hope for the best. Peter's embryo took on the second try. The doctors seemed relieved. Apparently, the process was harder than expected. Several other volunteers hadn't been as lucky. Carrying the child felt strange at first. Medical technology made it possible for humans of any gender to be pregnant, but Peter had never expected to experience it himself. Claire had always been the one who carried their children. Now he found himself dealing with morning sickness and weird food cravings and all the other joys of pregnancy that he'd only observed from the outside before. Admiral Voth visited him regularly. She seemed fascinated by the entire process. "You're really doing this," she said during one visit. "You're really carrying a child that isn't biologically yours." "It's biologically half mine," Peter corrected. "The doctors used my genetic material. So it's sort of mine and sort of yours and definitely its own person. You don't find this strange?" "I find everything about this situation strange." "But strange doesn't mean wrong." He patted his growing belly. "Besides, Claire always said I'd make a good mom if I put my mind to it. Guess I'm testing that theory." 3 months into the pregnancy, everything went wrong. Someone released a bioweapon in the volunteers' medical facility, something designed specifically to target the hybrid embryos and the humans carrying them. 3 volunteers died immediately. The others, including Peter, became critically ill. Peter survived only because he'd been in his greenhouse when the attack happened. The heavy radiation shielding he used to protect his plants from New Perth's harsh sun had also protected him from the worst of the weapon's effects. But he'd still been exposed. The doctors weren't sure if the embryo would survive. He woke up in a hospital bed with Admiral Voth sitting beside him. She looked different. It took him a moment to realize why. She was crying. He hadn't known draconids could cry. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was rough. "This is my fault. My people did this to you." Peter's throat was too dry to speak at first. He gestured for water. After a few sips, he managed, "Not your people. Some of your people. There's a difference. 3 humans died. Because of us. Because I asked for your help. And 23 of us survived. Including me. Including this kid." He put his hand on his belly. The doctors had told him earlier that the embryo was still viable. Still growing. Still fighting.
"What's the plan now?"
War came slowly at first, then all at once. Earth's military mobilized within hours of the bioweapon attack. The Draconid Communion scrambled to identify who had launched the assault. But humans didn't wait for answers. 3 volunteers were dead. 23 more had nearly died. That was enough. Peter watched the news from his secured hospital room while his body slowly healed and his hybrid child somehow kept growing despite everything. The reports showed human warships gathering at every colony, millions of vessels, most of them small and outdated by Draconid standards, but there were so many of them, like a swarm of angry bees facing down a handful of hawks. "Your species builds ships faster than we thought possible," Admiral Voth said during one of her visits. She looked tired, which seemed wrong for someone who was 12,000 years old. "Where do you find crews for all of them?" "We make more people," Peter said simply. "A Draconid captain might serve for thousands of years. A human captain serves for 30, maybe 40 years, then retires and trains 3 replacements. You have experience. We have numbers. Numbers might not be enough. They usually are, eventually. That's how humans work. We overwhelm problems with sheer volume and stubbornness." The investigation into the bioweapon attack led Admiral Voth to an organization Peter had never heard of before, the Patriarch Council, a secret group of the oldest Draconids who had decided that mixing their genetics with humans was worse than letting their species die. They'd spent 50,000 years building their civilization on the principle of genetic purity. The idea of hybrid children disgusted them. High Chancellor Drath gave Voth permission to hunt the Patriarch Council down. She took her flagship and a crew of loyalists who believed in the hybrid program. Peter watched her leave from his hospital window. Her ship was beautiful, all sweeping curves and silver metal that caught the sunlight like scales. The doctors moved Peter to a hidden station in deep space. Too many people wanted him dead now. The conspiracy theorists said he was part of an alien plot to replace humanity. The extremists said he was a traitor. The Patriarch Council wanted him dead because his child represented everything they feared. Even some humans who supported the program wanted him gone because he'd become too much of a symbol. And symbols made people uncomfortable. His children were moved to different locations for safety. Peter hated that most of all. He'd already lost Claire. The idea of losing his kids too made him want to scream. But screaming wouldn't help anyone, so instead he focused on staying healthy and growing the child inside him. The hidden station was small and cramped. Peter shared space with 6 other surviving volunteers and a medical team that rotated every few days for security reasons. They played cards to pass the time. They talked about their families. They tried not to think about the war happening across the galaxy. Admiral Voth sent messages when she could. Short updates about her hunt for the Patriarch Council. She tracked them to 17 different systems. Each time she got close, they vanished. They had resources and connections built over thousands of years. But Voth had determination and anger, and she'd discovered that anger was an excellent motivator even for someone as old as her. 6 months into Peter's pregnancy, Voth finally found them. An ancient temple world on the edge of Draconid space, a place so old that most had forgotten it existed. The Patriarch Council had hidden there, protected by thousands of followers who believed in their cause. The battle was short and brutal. Voth's flagship traded fire with defensive platforms while her ground forces stormed the temple. She led the assault personally, which seemed excessive to Peter when he heard about it later. But Voth had explained that some things required personal attention. The Patriarch Council had tried to kill her unborn child. That made it personal. She captured Elder Kesh, the leader of the Patriarch Council. He was 89,000 years old, which was ancient even by Draconid standards. He'd been alive when his species still reproduced naturally. He remembered the chaos and violence that came with competition for mates and resources. He'd been one of the original architects of the immortality program that had sterilized all Draconids. "I saved our species from tearing itself apart," Kesh told Voth during his interrogation. We chose order over chaos. We chose to fade peacefully rather than destroy ourselves fighting over breeding rights. Your humans will tear themselves apart, or they'll tear the galaxy apart. Either way, we saved the communion from that fate. Voth's response was simple. You chose death over life. That's not salvation, that's cowardice. She brought proof of the conspiracy back to the High Chancellor. Names, evidence, recorded confessions. Everything needed to prove that the attack on the volunteers had been orchestrated by the Patriarch Council without official communion approval. The evidence prevented all-out war between humans and draconids, but the damage was done. Trust had broken. Peace negotiations dragged on while military forces stayed on high alert. Peter went into labor while the negotiations were still failing. The doctors had tried to predict when it would happen, but hybrid biology didn't follow normal patterns. His water broke during breakfast, and then everything became a blur of medical activity and pain. Human births usually took hours. Peter's took 32 hours. The medical team had prepared for complications, and they found plenty. The child was larger than expected. The bone structure was different. There were moments when the doctors looked worried, and Peter decided he'd rather not know what they were worried about because he had enough to deal with already. Admiral Voth arrived halfway through the labor. She demanded to be there, and since she was technically one of the child's parents, the doctors allowed it. She stood in the corner of the medical room looking completely lost. 12,000 years old, veteran of countless battles, commander of fleets, and she had no idea how to handle watching someone give birth. Is he supposed to make those noises? She asked the doctors nervously. Yes, they answered in unison. The child was born just after midnight station time. Peter heard her cry before he saw her, and the sound was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Proof that she was alive. Proof that all of this had been worth it. They cleaned her up and handed her to him. She was perfect, mostly human in appearance, with bronze skin and dark curly hair that she'd inherited from Peter's genetic contribution. But along her tiny shoulders and down her spine she had scales. Opalescent scales that shimmered like oil on water, shifting through colors as she moved. Her eyes were larger than human normal, with vertical pupils like a cat or a dragon. She's beautiful, Admiral Voth whispered. She'd come closer to see. Her massive hand could have covered the baby's entire body, but she was so careful when she touched her. Just one scaled finger gently stroking the infant's cheek. What will you name her? Peter was exhausted. Everything hurt, but he smiled anyway. Hope. Her name is Hope. The genetic tests came back within hours. Hope was fertile, fully, completely fertile. The hybrid program had worked. She would be able to have children of her own someday. She'd inherited draconid immortality and human reproductive capability. She was exactly what both species needed her to be. News of Hope's birth spread across human and draconid space faster than Peter thought possible. The other surviving volunteers gave birth over the following weeks. 16 more viable hybrid children, all fertile, all healthy, all proof that the program worked. Everything changed after that. The war that had been building suddenly seemed pointless. Humans had demonstrated they could help. The Patriarch Council was in custody. The hybrid children existed and were thriving. Peace negotiations finally succeeded. Peter held his daughter and thought about Claire. She would have loved Hope. She would have loved all of this chaos and strangeness. She'd always said that life was supposed to be an adventure, and you couldn't have adventures by playing it safe. Hope's first birthday party changed the galaxy. Peter hadn't planned anything elaborate, just a small gathering on New Perth with family and the other hybrid children. But somehow the guest list had expanded to include representatives from 47 different alien species, 3 Earth ambassadors, and enough security personnel to invade a small planet. Everyone wanted to see the hybrid children. More importantly, everyone wanted what the hybrid children represented, a future. Species that had been sterile for millennia suddenly saw a possibility they'd thought was lost forever. If humans could help draconids reproduce, maybe they could help everyone. The requests started arriving within days of Hope's birth. By her first birthday, the Reproductive Rights Council on Earth was processing over 10,000 formal proposals from various alien species. The crystalline luminari who reproduced through budding but lost memories with each generation, the aquatic Tethians whose population had dwindled to barely 3,000 individuals, the machine race cognita who wanted organic bodies again, even species humans had never heard of before. Peter tried to focus on being a father while the galaxy went crazy around him. Hope was a normal child in most ways. She laughed and cried and needed diaper changes just like any human baby, but she also had scales that changed color based on her mood. And her grip was strong enough at 6 months old to dent metal. She was going to be interesting to raise. Admiral Voth visited often enough that Hope started calling her Mama, in addition to calling Peter Dad. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Voth had spent 12,000 years as a military commander. Parenting terrified her more than any battle ever had. She read every human book on child rearing she could find and still had no idea what she was doing most of the time. She threw food at me, Voth reported one day, sounding personally offended. I am an admiral of the Communion Fleet, and a 1-year-old child threw mashed vegetables at my head. Peter laughed until his sides hurt. Welcome to parenting. It doesn't get easier, just different. The black markets emerged within months of the hybrid program's success. Criminal organizations started kidnapping humans for forced breeding. Peter received death threats weekly from various sources. Some wanted him dead for helping aliens. Others wanted him dead because he wouldn't help their specific alien friends. Several kidnapping attempts targeted Hope specifically. The worst incident happened when Hope was 18 months old. A group calling themselves the True Humanity Front attacked the daycare center, where Hope and several other hybrid children spent their days. The goal was to kill the hybrids and prove that mixing species was wrong. Security stopped them before they reached the children, but 2 guards died in the fighting. Peter held his daughter that night and wondered what kind of galaxy he'd brought her into. She was too young to understand why someone would want to hurt her. She just wanted her stuffed dragon and her bedtime story. I'm scared, he admitted to Admiral Voth. I've been scared since Claire died, but this is different. This is people actively trying to kill my daughter because she exists. Then we don't let them succeed, Voth said firmly. Your species has a saying, the best revenge is living well. Hope will live. She will thrive. That's how we win. The Reproductive Rights Council established strict guidelines for the hybrid program. All genetic donation had to be voluntary. All surrogacy had to be voluntary and fairly compensated. Hybrid children had to have full rights equal to pure humans. No species could demand exclusivity or special treatment. Anyone who violated these rules would be permanently banned from the program. It wasn't enough to stop everyone. Several colonies were attacked by desperate species willing to take genetic material by force. Earth's military found itself fighting not just to defend humanity, but to defend the principle that reproduction should never be forced on anyone. Peter made a decision that most people thought was crazy. He volunteered to have more hybrid children, 3 more specifically, each for a different species. The Tethians who needed help urgently, the Luminari who had asked so politely, the plant-based Verdani who didn't even have a concept of violence in their culture and had been heartbroken when their request was denied. Due to limited volunteer availability, his adult children thought he'd lost his mind. Dad, you're 40 years old. You have 5 kids now, counting Hope. Why would you do this? Because I can, Peter said simply. Because these species asked for help and I'm able to give it. Because Hope deserves to live in a galaxy where people help each other instead of fighting over resources. The medical procedures took 6 months. 3 embryos, staggered so he wouldn't be carrying all of them at once. The Tethian hybrid developed in his body for the first 4 months, then was transferred to a specialized water tank for the remainder of the gestation. The Luminari hybrid grew normally but glowed in the dark, which made sleeping difficult. The Verdani hybrid was the strangest, requiring Peter to spend several hours each day in direct sunlight for photosynthesis support. Other humans followed his example. Volunteers stepped forward by the thousands. Some wanted adventure, some wanted the generous compensation, some just wanted to help. The motivations didn't matter as much as the result. Hybrid children started appearing across human space. Each one represented a species being saved from extinction. Not everyone was happy about it. 2 major factions emerged in opposition. The purists believed each species should remain genetically separate. They viewed hybrids as abominations and humans as a plague that was polluting the galaxy's genetic diversity. The breeders took the opposite extreme, believing the galaxy should be refertilized as fast as possible through mandatory programs and genetic manipulation to speed up reproduction. Peter found both groups equally disturbing. He helped organize a moderate faction that called itself the Garden. The name was his suggestion, based on his farming background. Gardens required planning and care. You didn't just throw seeds everywhere and hope for the best. You planted thoughtfully, nurtured carefully, and harvested sustainably. The garden's principles were simple: controlled sustainable population growth, respect for everyone's reproductive choices, strong laws against kidnapping and forced breeding, cultural integration programs so hybrid children would be accepted in both their parent species societies. It was common sense, which meant it was radical compared to the extremist positions. Admiral Voth retired from the Draconid military to join the Garden as their security advisor. The decision shocked the Communion. Admirals didn't retire. They served until they chose to die, which for Draconids meant serving for thousands of years. But Voth had found something more important than military service. She had a daughter now. She had a purpose beyond warfare. "In 12,000 years I've had 47 lovers," she told Peter one evening. They were watching Hope play with her new siblings. 3 more children, each a different species hybrid, each beautiful in their own way. None of them mattered like this matters. "You gave me a future, Peter. You gave all of us a future." Peter didn't know what to say to that. He'd just been trying to help. He hadn't planned to change the galaxy. He'd just been a gardener who felt sorry for a lonely alien and said yes when asked for help. But maybe that's how the biggest changes always happened. Not through grand plans or dramatic gestures, but through small kindnesses that grew into something larger, like planting seeds and watching them become forests. The Purists launched their first major attack when Hope was 16 years old. They bombed 3 hybrid education centers where young hybrids learned about their various heritages. The casualties were devastating. 412 children died. 89 adults. Peter's daughter Dawn was among them. His luminary human hybrid who glowed when she laughed. Who wanted to be a musician despite being tone deaf. Who was 16 years old and would never be 17. Everything changed after that. Peter stopped going outside after Dawn died. He stayed in his house on New Perth and stared at the walls and thought about how his daughter had glowed in the dark. Her luminary genetics had made her bioluminescent when she was happy. She'd light up her whole room just by laughing at something funny. Now that light was gone forever. His other children tried to help. Hope, now 20 years old with a child of her own, came to visit every day. His original 4 human children took turns staying with him. Even Admiral Voth practically moved in, though she had no idea how to deal with grief that wasn't her own. Draconids didn't process loss the same way humans did. 12,000 years gave you a different perspective on death. "You need to eat," Hope said gently, putting a plate of food in front of him. "Dad, please. Dawn wouldn't want you to stop living." "Dawn wanted to be a musician," Peter said. His voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. She was terrible at it. Couldn't carry a tune to save her life. But she practiced every day because she loved it. And now she's dead because someone decided hybrid children shouldn't exist. So we make sure her death meant something. We don't let the purist win." Peter looked at his daughter. His first hybrid child, the one who had changed everything. She had his brown eyes and her scales had darkened to a deep crimson like Admiral Voth's. She was beautiful and strong and everything he'd hoped she would be. "I can't lose you too," he whispered. "Then help me make sure no one else loses their children. Come back to the garden. We need you." He did go back eventually. Not because he'd stopped grieving, but because Hope was right. Dawn wouldn't have wanted him to give up. She'd been the most optimistic person he'd ever known, always seeing the best in everyone. Even when she struggled with music, she'd just laughed and tried again. The garden had grown since Peter had stepped away. What started as a small moderate faction had become a major political force in both human and communion space. Millions of members across hundreds of species, all working toward the same goal: sustainable population growth, respect for reproductive rights, protection for hybrid children. But the opposition had grown too. The Purists had bases on 70 different worlds now. They'd moved beyond protests and random attacks to organized terrorism. The education center bombing had been the worst incident, but it wasn't the only one. They'd destroyed hospitals that performed hybrid procedures. They'd assassinated volunteers. They'd even attacked several alien species who participated in the program, claiming they were traitors to their own kind. The breeders were just as dangerous in their own way. They'd established illegal cloning facilities where humans were copied without consent. They'd attempted to kidnap multiple volunteers for forced surrogate programs. They genuinely believed the ends justified the means. that repopulating the galaxy was important enough to override individual rights. High Chancellor Drath called for a communion-wide summit to address the crisis. Every member species sent representatives. The meeting was held on a neutral station, with enough security to fight off a small fleet. Peter attended as one of the garden's leaders, which still felt bizarre. He was a vegetable farmer who'd accidentally become famous. He had no business giving speeches at galactic summits, but he gave one anyway. They put him in front of thousands of delegates from species he'd never heard of, and he talked about Dawn, about how she'd glowed when she laughed, about how she'd been terrible at music but loved it anyway, about how she'd been 16 years old when someone decided her existence was wrong enough to kill her for it. Elder Kesh believes humans are a plague, Peter said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. Maybe we are. We've been called worse on our own world. Locusts, rabbits, vermin. All because we breed faster than others think is proper. But here's what Kesh doesn't understand. We don't breed because we're mindless animals. We have children because we hope. Every child is a bet on the future, a promise that tomorrow will be worth living in. The delegates listened in silence. Peter had their attention now. He could feel it. Dawn was that promise, and the purists killed her because they're afraid of hope. They're afraid that if species start mixing, they'll lose their identity, their purity, their control. But identity isn't about genetics. It's about choices. Dawn chose to be a musician even though she was bad at it. She chose to be kind even to people who hated her for existing. She chose hope every single day. That's what made her human and luminary both, not her DNA, her choices. He paused and looked around the massive assembly hall. I can't have more children of my own anymore. I'm too old. My body won't handle another pregnancy, but I can help others have theirs. I'll do whatever else I can to help before my body gives out. Not for revenge, not to spite the purists, but because Dawn would want me to keep planting seeds. The speech went viral across every network in human and communion space. People who had been undecided about the hybrid program suddenly had an opinion. The garden's membership tripled within a month. But more importantly, the communion finally took decisive action against the purists. Admiral Voth came out of retirement to command the military operation. She'd spent 3 years learning how to be a mother. Now she went back to being a warrior, and she was angry. Her adopted daughter had died in that bombing. Hope had lost a sister. Peter had lost a child. The purists had made it personal. The operation took 6 months and involved forces from 40 different species. They hit every known purist base simultaneously. Some purists surrendered. Most fought. The casualties were heavy on both sides. 40,000 dead by the time it ended. Most of them young humans who'd volunteered to protect the hybrid children they'd helped create. Peter watched the reports and felt old. He was 54 now, which wasn't ancient by human standards, but felt like it. His body hurt in ways it never had before. The multiple pregnancies had taken their toll. The doctor said he was healthy enough, but he could feel time catching up with him. Hope visited with his granddaughter. The little girl was 3 years old, a beautiful mix of human and draconid features. She called Peter Papa and loved hearing stories about her Aunt Dawn that she'd never meet. The purist leadership has been captured, Hope told him. They're going to trial next month. They want you to speak again. Peter looked at his granddaughter playing with her toys. What's the point? Speaking won't bring Dawn back. No. But it might save someone else's Dawn. Someone else's daughter who deserves to grow up and be terrible at music and happy anyway. He smiled despite everything. She really was awful at music. The worst, Hope agreed. But she was ours, and we loved her. The trial of the purist leadership became the most watched event in galactic history. Elder Kesh stood as the primary defendant, along with 47 other organizers of the attacks. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They didn't deny their actions. They were proud of them. Peter attended every day of the trial. He sat in the gallery and listened to them justify terrorism as protecting genetic purity. He heard them call hybrid children abominations that needed to be eliminated for the good of all species. He watched them show no remorse for the 412 children they'd killed. When it was time for impact statements from victims' families, Peter spoke last. He kept it short. Dawn wanted to be a musician. She practiced every day even though she was tone deaf. She chose happiness over perfection. She chose hope over fear. You killed her because you were afraid of what she represented. Afraid that maybe genetic purity isn't as important as we've been told. Afraid that maybe the future belongs to people who choose to build bridges instead of walls. He looked directly at Elder Kesh. You're 89,000 years old. You've lived longer than any human civilization has existed. And in all that time, you never learned the most important lesson.
Life isn't about lasting forever.
It's about what you leave behind. Dawn lived 16 years and left behind more love than you've created in 90 millennia. That's the difference between us. The tribunal found all defendants guilty. The sentences ranged from permanent exile to execution, depending on each individual's role in the attacks. Elder Kesh received permanent imprisonment on an isolated world, alone, with no contact with any species. For a being who had lived 89,000 years surrounded by civilization, it was perhaps the cruelest sentence possible. Peter's greenhouse on New Perth had become something of a shrine. People came from across the galaxy to see where the human gardener had first met Admiral Voth and changed everything. They'd leave flowers and tokens and sometimes just stand there quietly, thinking about their own families and futures. Peter found it all deeply strange. It was just a greenhouse. He still grew tomatoes there. He was 87 years old now, and his body finally matched how tired he felt inside. The doctors said his heart was failing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just slowly winding down like an old clock. He had maybe a year left, maybe less. He'd already lasted longer than most humans who'd gone through multiple surrogate pregnancies. His body had done remarkable work. Now it needed to rest. Hope visited every day with his great-grandchildren. 13 of them now, ranging from infants to teenagers. A whole extended family tree that included draconid branches and luminary branches and Tethian branches, and several species Peter still couldn't pronounce correctly. They were loud and chaotic and perfect. Admiral Voth came too, though she walked slower these days. 12,000 years old, and she'd finally started to show her age after learning how to be a mother and grandmother and great-grandmother. She'd told Peter once that caring about people was exhausting in ways that commanding fleets had never been, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. The council wants to give you another medal, she said one afternoon. They were sitting in the greenhouse surrounded by tomato plants that Peter had spent 60 years perfecting. For services to galactic unity. I have 14 medals already, Peter said. Where am I supposed to put another one? You could wear it. I'm a farmer. We don't wear medals to work. They get dirty. Voth laughed, that deep rumbling sound he'd learned to love over the decades. You've changed the galaxy, Peter Rourke. 400,000 humans now volunteer in the surrogate corps. Population growth has been recorded in 73 species that were previously sterile. The garden has become the dominant political force in the communion. And it all started because you felt sorry for a lonely alien at a garden party. I didn't change anything, Peter corrected gently. I just planted some seeds. Other people did the real work of making them grow. But that wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. The Rourke Accords had become galactic law, protecting reproductive rights and hybrid children across all communion space. His speeches had inspired millions. His example had shown people that helping others didn't require grand gestures, just willingness to say yes when asked. His original 4 human children visited less frequently now. They had their own families and lives spread across multiple planets, but they called often, and Peter treasured those conversations. They'd all turned out well. Good parents themselves, kind people. He and Claire had done something right. Dawn's absence still hurt, 31 years after her death, and Peter still sometimes turned to tell her something before remembering she was gone. Hope said the pain never fully disappeared, you just learned to carry it differently. She would know. She'd lost a sister and watched her father slowly die and seen the galaxy tear itself apart, and rebuild and tear itself apart again. The breeders had been dealt with years ago, dismantled through legal action and careful diplomatic pressure. The purists still existed, but they were a fringe group now, largely irrelevant in a galaxy where hybrid children had become normal. 3 generations of hybrids had been born. They were teachers and doctors and artists and farmers. They were just people living their lives. Peter's health declined sharply in late autumn. The doctors moved him to a medical facility. Though he'd argued for staying in his greenhouse, Hope overruled him gently but firmly. He needed proper care, and she wasn't going to let stubbornness kill him before his heart did. His room had windows that overlooked gardens. Someone, probably Hope, had made sure of that. Peter spent his days watching plants grow and thinking about everything he'd planted, both literal and metaphorical, the tomatoes and carrots and beans, the seeds of hope scattered across the galaxy, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried pieces of him into a future he'd never see. Admiral Voth rarely left his side during those final weeks. She held his hand with her massive scaled one and told him stories about Hope's children and grandchildren, about the Garden's latest diplomatic victories, about the new Draconid human luminari hybrid who had just been elected to the Communion Council, about how the galaxy was becoming something beautiful and strange and new. "We did it," she said quietly one evening. "Your daughter Dawn's generation, they're the ones truly changing things. They don't remember a galaxy without hybrids. To them this is just normal." Peter smiled. "That's good. Normal is good. Normal means we succeeded." "I'll miss you," Voth said, and there were tears in her ancient eyes. 12,000 years and I've never felt lost like this. How do humans handle it? Knowing everyone they love will die? We plant gardens, Peter said simply. We plant gardens and we teach our children to tend them. We know we won't see the full harvest, but we plant anyway. That's what hope is. Planting seeds for a harvest you'll never see. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered in his final days. They filled his room and spilled into the hallways. Hybrid children of every combination imaginable, human children and their alien partners. A family tree that had grown so vast and complex that Peter had stopped trying to memorize all the names and just loved them all equally. Hope held his hand on his left side. Admiral Voth held his hand on his right side. His first hybrid daughter and the ancient alien who had started all of this, both of them keeping him company as he prepared to leave. Tell them I'm proud, Peter whispered. His voice was weak now, barely audible. All of them. Every child and grandchild and great-grandchild. Tell them their papa was proud. They know, Hope said through her tears. They've always known. Peter closed his eyes and thought about Claire, about meeting her when they were both 20 and stupid and full of plans, about their 4 children who had been everything they'd hoped for, about the garden party where he'd met a lonely alien and said yes to an impossible request, about Dawn glowing in the dark, about Hope holding her first child, about all the seeds he'd planted and all the gardens he'd tended. The galaxy was full of life now, growing, changing, becoming something new, and he'd been part of that. A small part, just a gardener who'd shared what he had when someone asked for help. But small parts mattered. Every seed mattered. Every choice to help instead of walk away mattered. He died peacefully just after midnight, surrounded by family, leaving behind a legacy that would outlive him by millennia. They buried him in his greenhouse, which violated about 17 different health codes, but everyone agreed to ignore them. They planted a tree over his grave, a earth oak that had been modified to grow in New Perth soil. Over the decades it would grow massive, its roots spreading through the greenhouse, its branches reaching for the sky. Admiral Voth came to the greenhouse often after Peter's death. She was 12,087 years old now, and she'd finally started to understand what humans meant when they talked about being old. She'd lived for millennia, but Peter's decades had somehow been more full than all her centuries combined. Hope joined her one afternoon. She was 50 now, with gray in her hair and scales that had faded to a softer crimson. She'd lived half a human lifetime and had centuries more ahead of her. Sometimes the math of hybrid immortality seemed cruel. She'd outlive her human siblings by thousands of years. But she'd also see things they never would. Gardens planted by their father growing into forests that covered planets. Do you think he knew? Hope asked quietly. How much he changed things? Voth shook her head. No, that was part of what made him special. He never thought he was doing anything important. Just helping where he could. They stood together in the greenhouse, 2 of the people who'd loved Peter Rourke most, surrounded by the tomato plants he'd perfected over 60 years. Outside, New Perth had grown to a population of 40 million. Across the galaxy, hybrid children played in streets and schools and gardens. Species that had been dying were thriving again. The sterile empire had become fertile ground. Hope pulled out a packet of seeds from her pocket. Tomato seeds saved from her father's best plants. Want to help me plant these? Voth took some of the seeds carefully. She still wasn't good at gardening after all these years. But Peter had taught her that being good at something wasn't the point. The point was trying anyway. The point was planting seeds even when you didn't know if they'd grow. The point was hope itself. They planted together in the soil near Peter's tree. pressing seeds into the earth and covering them gently. The seeds were small and ordinary, but given time and care and a little bit of hope, they'd grow into something that could feed people. That's all Peter had ever wanted. To feed people, to help them grow, to plant seeds for harvests he'd never see. The galaxy remembered him not as a hero or a savior, but as exactly what he'd always been, a gardener who'd shared what he had when asked, who'd said yes to an impossible request and changed everything in the process, who'd understood that the greatest revolutions don't come from grand gestures, but from small kindnesses repeated until they become forests. Across the communion, in greenhouses and gardens and small farms, people planted seeds and thought about Peter Rourke, the human gardener who'd looked at a dying galaxy and saw only soil waiting for seeds, who'd grieved for his lost daughter but kept planting anyway, who'd taught an ancient alien admiral that immortality without children wasn't living, just existing. His legacy grew with every hybrid child born, with every species saved from extinction, with every garden planted and every seed scattered across the stars, not because he'd been special or powerful or wise, but because he'd been kind when kindness mattered most. In the end, Peter Rourke's greatest crop wasn't vegetables or even children. It was hope itself, scattered across the stars like seeds on fertile ground, growing into forests that would outlast every empire and every species that had ever called the galaxy home.